This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe. The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice. They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist.
Well, where there's truth is that carbon is the basis of all life on Earth. Mm-hmm. And where there's truth is that carbon dioxide is the source of that carbon for all life on Earth. And it's also true that for the last 600 million years, of which we have a reasonable record, CO2 has been declining in the global atmosphere to the point where at the peak of the last glaciation, when the oceans absorb more CO2 than they do when they're warm, it was cold, CO2 dropped to 180 parts per million.
Yeah.
And that is only 30 parts per million above the death of plants. And it is surmised because there's an ash layer associated with these peaks in cold during the glaciations.
It's only 30 parts per million above the death of plants.
Yes, and it's very clear from my paper that I've just published that if we had not intervened by putting the balance back into the carbon cycle, which was out of balance, it's a really interesting story because it's life itself that has sucked the CO2 out of the atmosphere over the millennia and put it into fossil fuels, but that's a very minor part of it. Mm-hmm. The big part of it is what's called carbonaceous rocks, limestone, chalk, and marble. And those are the remains of shells of marine calcifying organisms. And the calcium carbonate is what those shells are made out of. Mm-hmm. The carbon in the calcium carbonate is from CO2 that the oceans absorbed from the atmosphere. And that is what we're fracking for oil and gas, are those marine deposits of the shells of coccolithophores, which are minute phytoplankton that learned how to build. Many marine organisms started 500 million years ago. Many marine organisms learned how to control calcification. Mm-hmm. Biomineralization is the general term for it. Our bones, for example, are a case of biomineralization. But we did it for our skeletal structure, so we could stand up. Mm-hmm. The reason marine organisms did it was to basically build an armor plating around themselves, like clams and mussels and coral reefs and crabs. All of these are calcareous. And the calcium comes from the seawater. The carbonate comes from the air and is dissolved in the water. And so these huge deposits of shale are actually calcium carbonate. They are the shells of those plankton. The oil and gas is the organic matter of the living plankton that died, fell on the bottom of the ocean. But 100 million billion tons of carbonaceous rock represent carbon dioxide pulled out of the atmosphere. And because the Earth has cooled over the millennia, nature is no longer putting CO2 into the atmosphere to offset this. So the curves are there to look at on the internet. You can see it. CO2 has been declining to where it is getting close to the end of plant life. And another 1.8 million years, if you just take that line and draw it straight down, another 1.8 million years, life would begin to die on planet Earth for lack of CO2.
Not because of an excess.
There is no such thing as an excess of CO2 under any real-world circumstance.
Well, the message out there is pretty clear that there is such a thing.
No, there isn't. Because it's proven fact, for example, that greenhouse growers they actually buy CO2 in bottles.
Well, I know, they pump it in.
They pump it in to get it up to 1,000 parts per million. The optimum CO2 level for plant growth, which, when you think about it, is the basis of all the animal life on Earth. Every insect, every vertebrate, every invertebrate, all the things that are not plants depend on the plants for their existence. The sugars the plants produce through photosynthesis are the energy supply for the whole world. What are those sugars made out of? Water and carbon dioxide. Those are and when you burn fossil fuels, which are the result of photosynthesis, what do you get? Water and carbon dioxide and some contaminants, which we know how to clean. But that's what basically comes out of the tailpipe, is water and CO2. Plants take those two things and turn them into glucose, sugar, and everything else goes from there.
I mean, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, the first reason is that I spent a lot of time reading. I worked for a UN committee for 2 years on sustainable economic and ecological development, and read a very large amount during that period of time and learned a lot, much of which made me much more optimistic than I had been before I read the relevant literature, which was a real shock to me. But the climate change issue is an absolutely catastrophic, nightmarish mess, and the idea that will unite us that's not going to unite us. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to separate the science from the politics. And second, even if the more radical claims are true, we have no idea what to do about it. And so, no. And besides, it's even worse than that. Here's one of the worst things about the whole mess is, so as you project outwards with regards to your climate change projections, which are quite unreliable to begin with, and the unreliability of the measurement magnifies as you move forward in time, obviously, because the errors accumulate. And so if you go out 50 years, the error bars around the projections are already so wide that we won't be able to measure the positive or negative effects of anything we do right now. So how in the world are you going to solve a problem when you can't even measure the consequence of your actions? Like, how is that even possible? And besides that, well, what's the solution? What are we going to do? Switch to wind and solar? Well, good luck with that. Just try it and see what happens. We can't store the power. Germany tried it. They produced more carbon dioxide than they did when they started because they had to turn on their coal-fired plants again. That wasn't a very good plan. Well, we don't want nuclear. It's like, okay, what happens at night? The sun goes down. Well, isn't that something we should have taken into account? We got to flip on the coal-fired plants. Well, so it was a complete catastrophe, and all that happened was the price of electricity shot up. It was like zero utility. That's not a solution. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we should cut back. We can't consume as much as we are all consuming. It's like, well, maybe, except the data that I've read indicate that if you can get the GDP of people up to about $5,000 a year, then they start caring about the environment, and the environment cleans up. So you could make a perfectly strong case, I think, and a reasonable one, perhaps even a humane one, that the actual idea would be to get everybody in the world who's poor, desperately so, out of poverty as fast as possible, which would increase consumption in the short term, because then they'd start to care about the environment and things would clean up. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do about global warming? Well, good luck figuring that out. I don't see a solution on the horizon. I look at Bjorn Lomborg's work. I really like Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's a real genius. You can look him up if you want. He took the UN millennial goals. There's 200 of them. That's way too many goals if you're serious about goals, by the way, because 200 goals isn't a plan. It's a wish list. You have to prioritize. I'm serious. You have to prioritize, but they won't prioritize because each of the goals has its constituents, And if you prioritize, then you irritate the constituents. But if you don't prioritize, then you can't implement the plan. So what Lomborg did was gather a teams of economists, multiple teams, some of whom were Nobel Prize-winning economists. He had them assemble teams. He had them rank order development goals in terms of their return on investment, all of the teams. Then he averaged across the teams and came up with a final list. And addressing global warming wasn't even on the list. The most fundamental, he wrote a book called How to Spend $75 Billion to Make the World a Better Place, and that's not very much money on a global scale. Almost everything that he recommended had to do with increased child nutrition in developing countries. It's like, these things are complicated, man. These are complicated. It's like, well, let's fix global warming. It's like, okay, well, good luck with that. First of all, how are you going to do that? And to think that will unite us, well, certainly not uniting us so far. So, no. And it's the kind of low-resolution thinking that just gets us absolutely nowhere. I like what Lomborg did way better. I think it's way more intelligent. So, you know, maybe if you increase child nutrition enough and you produce another, I don't know, 10 million geniuses as a consequence of that, and maybe one of them will figure out what to do about global warming. Well, I'm serious about that, you know? It's not a bad thing to increase the total sum of human brain power, you know? And so we treat these things so lightly. Well, let's fix the planet. Well, we're going to concentrate on global warming. Well, why global warming? Well, because everyone thinks that's the biggest catastrophe. Well, maybe it is, but if you don't have a solution, well, and then what about all those other problems? What are you going to do about them? Well, we'll ignore them because we can feel good about, you know, being concerned about global warming. It's like, you know, one of the reasons, there's more trees in the Northern Hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. No one knows that, but it's true, and by a substantial margin. You know why, in part? Because people burned coal instead of wood. It's like everyone says, well, we shouldn't burn coal. It's like, okay, fair enough. What do you want to do, burn trees instead? Because that's what poor people would have done. It's like, coal isn't good. Well, it's better than burning wood. So these things are complicated. So they're unbelievably complicated. And so, no, it's not going to unite us. And we're not going to do a damn thing about it either. So it doesn't really matter. So, well, what are we going to do? You're going to stop, like, having heat? You're going to stop having electricity? You're going to stop driving your cars? You're going to stop taking trains? It's like, you know, you're going to stop using your iPhones? You're not going to do any of that. And no wonder. So, no.
So, here are some of the views I collected on climate change. One of Greta Thunberg, another of Jordan Peterson, and of course Dr. Patrick Moore. Three perspectives, three different ideas. The question is, which do you believe? I am inclined to take the word of scientists, because when I look at Greta, she seems to have appointed herself a spokesman of science, spokesperson of science, and spokesperson of future generations, to condemn the current generation for the irresponsibility of ignoring climate change and pollution and whatnot. So I don't know much about Greta, but I can say that just studying her message that I found on the United Nations YouTube channel, it's a very polarizing message. It's designed to shame people into action. At the end of that statement, she talked about machines that would have to suck hundreds of millions of or billions of tons of CO2 from the atmosphere to prevent warming increasing past 1.5 degrees. First of all, that kind of thing, to engineer such a device would be ludicrous in its pursuit. And in addition to that, as Dr. Patrick Moore said, if she knew anything about science, she knows that carbon dioxide is part of life. Carbon dioxide and water is part of life, necessary for life. If we go below 150 parts per million of carbon dioxide, plant life will cease to exist. So we're at 180 now, 30 away. It's another statement that, well, you can choose to believe him or not, but as I studied and as I showed in previous videos, he was one of the founding members of Greenpeace and left for reasons of that Greenpeace had lost its way, its ideals, so to speak, and lost it to a kind of fanaticism and radical ideology that was against the human race, and stated that the human race is the problem. That human beings, anti-human perspective, and he could not abide that. That's not the solution. So, if I may create a rebuttal to Greta Thunberg, her policy, if you will, or her perspective seems to be something of a fear-mongering, public shaming, so to speak. And the message is very passionate. I can see in her face. I think she believes what she's talking about. But the fact that she's approaching from that perspective is very, it's divisive, and it seems to accomplish nothing. And there's a lot of the science that she claims to know and to understand is not a mature perspective. It's and it seems that the speech that she's reading off of is somewhat rehearsed, prepared, and designed to be as influencing and power-reaching as it can. A call to action, so to speak. So, in that way, if you want to believe in either perspective, that's up to you. But really, I find it to be a very polarizing stance. So it creates division, and it's designed to create a call to action no matter the consequence. And then we have Jordan Peterson, who went on at length after being asked by one of the students in the crowd. He dismissed it because he finds the idea to be a pursuit of foolishness, I want to say. This is a man who, as he said, he worked for the United Nations and so on, and did a lot of reading on the subject. And I believe that. I don't believe that Jordan Peterson goes into any kind of thing without first thoroughly studying it, and people who support him and who know him believe that as well, I'm sure. That his approach is apolitical and science-oriented, and I won't question his integrity when it comes to studying a subject and his knowledge about that subject. And he does extensive research on a subject before he even brings it out. And as he says, he does his best to break it, and with the biggest hammer that he can find, and try to shake things loose and find if it's solid as a rock. So that's his mentality. But in terms of climate change, he suggested a more humanistic approach, which is try to raise people out of poverty as fast as you can, and among those that rise, there will be someone there that with enough brain power, the collaborative brain power of the human race brought out of poverty, will help us to find the solutions that are necessary for these big issues that we really don't know how to solve. So it's very, very important to have the humanistic perspective when trying to solve these problems that are beyond our scope of reasoning. And even so, he says at the time, we don't have any accredited solutions that are credible to solve the issue at hand. And our projections, we make projections on climate change, and those are neither reliable nor an adequate way to measure our progress, let's say, in the future and future goals and so on. So he rejects the premise that climate change itself is the real issue at hand. The real issue at hand is trying to get the human race out of poverty and up to a good standard of living, a healthy, a dignified standard of living, well educated, well looked after. His perspective is to take care of human beings first. Raise us out of poverty, and then from that, the benefits of the brain power combined and so on of humanity itself will find a solution to the problem. So who do you believe? I asked that question. If you want to comment, I welcome your comments and your perspective. I love to hear it. The more people that I talk to is brilliant to me. That's one of the reasons I love YouTube is the amount of people that come forward and want to express their views. That's my favorite thing about it. So I want to hear your perspective. Please comment if you like this video. Please like or subscribe to my channel if you like this video. But I thank you for your time and attention, and goodbye.